Let's come together and let's get rolling. So I'm so glad you're all here. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you. My name is Dr. Michael Laminack. I have been going to St. Andrew for a few years now. My wife and I, we moved up here in 2020. I had finished my on-campus stuff for my PhD. I was in the joint doctoral program with DU and ILIF. And I'll say more about that in a minute, but I actually came up here to get some teaching experience. I was teaching at a public classic charter school, teaching 7th, 8th, 11th, and 12th graders history and philosophy. So, yeah. I mean, I'll tell you, what I found is, so right now I'm adjuncting actually a philosophy of religion class at DU, and I mean, if you're comfortable teaching any age, and anybody that's willing to listen and if you give feedback and grow together, you can teach anybody. It's great, and I enjoy it. And ultimately, we're having a conversation together, and I hope that we can kind of have some exchange as we go forward. And I appreciate those of you that have some personalities and want to speak out. Let's do it. I'm good. So a little more about me. We've been going to St. Andrew kind of somewhat inconsistently. We have 2 kids, 4-year-old son, and about to turn 2 at the end of this week, a little girl. So they were actually both baptized back in November, which was the same week that I defended my dissertation. I became a doctor back in November, finished my PhD. My work is in political theology, which is the intersection of religion and political philosophy, and we're going to see both of those things kind of as we go throughout this little series. But my work covers, it is a comparative analysis of Karl Barth, who is a Christian theologian, pretty important for the 20th century, and we'll dive into his thought here, along with this Jewish philosopher named Emanuel Levinas. And we'll see a little bit of his work in this because his influence philosophically guides my analysis of Barth as well, and we'll see that as we go. We're going to start off with a little bit, I want to give you some guide to what we're going to be covering. So today, this session will be Karl Barth's theology in historical political context. And the key themes that we're going to be dealing with here are ethno-nationalism, then and there and here, and then and now. So a combination of this kind of comparison between what's happening for Barth in Germany with the rise and coming to fruition of the Third Reich, and dealing with some of what we deal with ethno-nationalism in the historical context in America as well. And I'll give a little bit more explanation to that as we go. Then we're going to talk a little bit about biblical authority after modernity. So dealing with, hey, what does the Bible mean, and how does or how should it shape our ethics and our approach to politics after modernity? So modernity being that focus on reason, and when we really start to critically approach the Bible and start to kind of shed a lot of those traditional beliefs. That's what we're dealing with that topic. And then finally, theological ethics and political action. So these 3 things are going to be closely related. When I say ethno-nationalism, does anybody have an idea of what I'm talking about there? Fantastic. Oh, a guess. Give me a guess.
Well, it would be having an ethnic group create a nationalistic government that says we're the best and everyone else is subjugated, basically. I mean, there's some African countries that have done that. You could
Excellent.
say the United States is doing that too.
We'll say that within certain boundaries, yes. Yeah, so ultimately, it's an understanding of an us versus them framework, usually predicated upon some kind of ethnic distinction. Yeah.
Hitler's Germany is perfect.
Yeah, we're going to be dealing with that, yeah. So that's what we're dealing with, yeah. So when I say ethno-nationalism, I mean, one of the easiest references to deal with is the Third Reich and Hitler's Germany. So that's what we'll be dealing with. That is Barth's ultimate context that I want to be laying out here, is that he forms his theology in the backdrop of this ardent nationalism. It actually begins after World War I, and he starts developing in the interwar years, and then it really comes to fruition, and you see the effect on political action and ethics with his approach to and response to the Third Reich, which, if, as you brought up, if we see this kind of rise of ethno-nationalism today, then it offers some thoughts and how we might work as the church or as individuals in society to confront and approach and deal with ethno-nationalism. So, excellent. Okay, so some guiding questions to get going. What does the phrase biblical authority mean or mean to you? I would love to hear some thoughts on that, just to know where we're coming from as we move forward.
Because we're Methodists?
Wait, because you're Methodist? So we'll say, all right, so a little bit more background about myself, just so we're clear. I grew up in a trailer park in West Texas, just so we're clear. So that kind of places me sociologically in a lot of other ways. I also grew up a KJV-only Baptist, fundamentalist Baptist. So I've got that behind me, but I'm also a far distance from that. But just to give you a little bit more about that for a second, Barth's theology was particularly helpful to me because I went through this process of distancing from my family and my tradition. But Barth allowed me to have a critical approach to theology that also allows me to embrace and respect my own tradition. So I ended up, after about halfway through seminary, I kind of came to terms with my KJV only family, and I started my undergraduate degree, I began studying Greek, and I went back that first semester, got into an argument with my grandparents. My grandmother called me brainwashed, and that was a problem. That was a problem for 4 or 5 years after that. But after that, in the middle of seminary, going to a moderate seminary at Baylor, I ended up preaching a sermon or two at my grandparents' church, and even performed part of my grandfather's funeral service a couple years ago. That was really significant to me. And it's important to me to have an understanding of the faith that is broader than my own perspective, and that can allow me to say, hey, if we are all indeed sinners and we're all falling short of a higher standard, then I can't exclude them, even as much as I might disagree with them. So, y'all might disagree with that, and that's okay, but I want to give you an idea of some of that development theologically that got me there. So, biblical authority. Let's go back to that question. Sorry. So there's a little bit of distance with Methodist Baptist, but I don't fit easily in those grooves necessarily, but I doubt you do either, if we're being honest. So, yeah, give me your thoughts.
Well, biblical authority is in the Bible. It says it, and the Bible has authority. It's the Word of God, and then it must be true or false.
Okay.
Or inspired
Other
Word
thoughts?
of God.
Okay.
Not inerrant, just inspired.
Inspiration. So inspiration versus inerrant. What is inerrancy?
Perfect, no errors.
All right, cool. Perfect in what sense?
Like every word given by God in English.
Yeah. Yeah. No. So. No. You're good. You're good. So interestingly, if you look at the Chicago Statement, which is the kind of widest agreed upon statement of inerrancy, it's actually that it is inerrant, it is without error in the original manuscripts. Which again, if you start to study Greek, then you're like, what the hell are those manuscripts that we're talking about? Which is part of the problem. Can I say that? Can I say that? All right, sorry. Okay, yeah. So. Yeah, so that's a question, and in fact, a lot of what draws me to Barth is an answer to the question of inerrancy, because ultimately, not being able to deal with science and the huge wealth of knowledge that we've gained through the scientific revolution and modernity, not being able to address or accept any of that is a real problem. And it's a particular problem if you come from West Texas, where the people are doing all of this oil and gas drilling and everything. We got to know this information about the history of this land and what's happening, and yet you got to throw all that out as soon as you step into the church. That's a problem to me. And I think we're seeing ramifications of that politically and societally. But, okay, we are way off topic again. So, but we got some things on the table. So having the Bible as a guide for your life, the idea that the words of the Bible are inspired, or the concept of inerrancy, that the words of the Bible themselves are free of error, and particularly free of error in the sense of being rationally factual. And that's something that we want to deal with a little bit. Anybody else have anything to add on the meaning of biblical authority? Does the phrase itself piss anybody off?
It makes me run.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. You might feel like running, and that's okay, but I hope you remain and just express your discomfort. That'd be great. Okay. We've probably already dealt with this somewhat, but how has biblical authority been used, misused, represented, and misrepresented? Any thoughts on that? Anything you want to add that we want to bring to the table? Give me a few. Give me a few of thoughts here. Interesting. Okay. Maybe I don't want to dive super headfirst into that one at the moment. I don't know. Do we? I don't know if there's agreement in this room. I'm not going to make assumptions, so I don't want to get us completely off topic. Okay. Other things, though. Or let's just say political disagreements. When it's dependent upon a particular understanding of biblical authority, just becomes a way of saying, this is how it must be, and if you disagree, you're wrong and going to hell, all that fun stuff. I'm sorry? I am not going to be dealing with this as a weaponized type. Yeah. It is easily weaponized, right? Okay.
The wars have started over biblical authority.
For sure. Which wars would you be thinking about?
The
Crusades? Interesting. Yeah. That's probably a little bit further step. Yeah, you're not wrong. Yeah, but that would be over different scriptures. But there's plenty of wars since then that have also been more specifically about this, particularly between Catholics and Protestants in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere. Oh yeah. Troubles, yeah, for sure. Okay, excellent. So we're clicking here. That's good. What do we think? Is there any value to the concept of biblical authority?
I always think that it's a place to start in a historical context. Oh, well said. I mean, it was written in a context for a reason, and we can start there, and we don't have to end there.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I was thinking biblical identity. That is part of my identity as a Christian. The Bible has an authority in my life. Not the authority in the terms of understanding life and guidance and stuff like that. Not being used as a division necessarily.
I like what you had to say there about identity and it being something authoritative in some sense in your life. We'll return to that theme a good bit. Other thoughts?
Wouldn't it be I think of it as a biblical guideline instead of an authority.
Okay. That's fair. And we could phrase this differently for sure. This is just the kind of phrase that I've gone with. And at least partially what I'll be expressing by it is a sense that there's some kind of guideline or authority or some sense of meaning that calls into question my own thinking, against which that I would compare my actions in order to guide how I live, or how we as a community or as a church might live. So that's what I'm meaning by that. All of the ways that it could go wrong with that is a part of the risk that is included within that. But we'll continue to expand as we go. All right, what's the relationship between the Bible and ethics or the Bible and politics? Or what should be that relationship?
Well, the word ethics maybe is a neutral term, but if we were to look at it in terms of positive ethics or accepted ethics for our culture, those are oftentimes rooted in biblical scriptures, just Jesus' teachings, be kind to the stranger, all of his teachings.
Ten Commandments.
Sure, there's another one. So they're really closely tied, but it's a cultural tie that's done.
Okay. Other thoughts?
The teaching for kids. What would Jesus do?
That specific phrase has a really long and interesting history, actually. It goes back to a 19th century evangelist that was then printed in a bunch of different things and became a whole phenomenon. But yeah, that's an interesting point. Definitely not just for kids, though, and that's perhaps an unfortunate thing, but very, very slimmed down version. Other thoughts?
I think they should be together. I mean, the Bible
remember that about the disciple studies that I did in the past, and really talking about, there's Jesus's teachings, which I think are very authoritative. I mean, they're what we want to follow and stuff. But then, you get into some of the letters that are in the New Testament, and you don't have the whole context of where some of those comments that have been used, say, for homosexuality and stuff, you don't have the whole picture of why that was being written and stuff. And, I just remember one class where they were talking about, it was what was going on in the temples at the time, as opposed to society necessarily,
Right.
And so I think, we have to be really careful taking the Bible and applying some of that to our politics and our ethics and stuff, because we're taking it out of context.
Interesting. Yes. Okay.
And I've read the historian Thomas Cahill. He's got The Gift of the Jews, and his claim in that is the Ten Commandments saved humanity, set the stage for ethics and right living as we see it from way back. The laws of Hammurabi and all that, and we're influenced by the Ten Commandments. Of course, we're not even sure there were 10 at the start, but
I mean, he chunks one of the tablets, or two of the tablets. One of the tablets. Anyways, yeah.
But
See, that's right.
anyway, he's a fun historian.
That's it. I would take issue with some of the claims there, but that neither here nor there right now. So let's go ahead and move forward. These are good thoughts. I asked the same question. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and dive in. I want us to read this passage real quick, and I want us to be thinking about these two questions, which is, what does this mean for philosophical or scientific knowledge, and what can we know as humans and or as people of faith? And I'll just go ahead and read this for us. I know this is a little bit small print. This is 1 Corinthians 1, verses 18 through 31. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength.
This is why there's so many denominations. There's so many opinions. It's a confusing book.
That's an interesting thought. What other thoughts are we having?
My thought was we all learn differently. And, maybe trying to get to the same point. We all learn differently. Some need science, some need wisdom, some just go with faith. I'm a little confused by this, to be honest with you.
Fair enough.
Faith and science answer two different questions.
We're going to be heading in that direction. Yeah. Yes.
This is not a biology textbook.
No. On the other hand, God is in creation. So I like to say God created science, therefore we need to respect it.
So saying that God created science, what do you mean by God created science?
That it is in all creation, from the rocks to the skies to all living beings.
So I'm going to get a little pedantic. because just to make a philosophical point here, and somewhat theological, but when we're thinking of science, I mean, that would be a human action of trying to find something out about creation or the universe, however we want to phrase that exactly. So I would push back against saying that God created science or put science into things. There might be a sense in which there's something that is available to us within created matter that we can gain some knowledge of, but we wouldn't call that science. Science is something that we do. And
Why do we do it? Did not God create?
that's great. Yeah, I like that. I mean, so if we're going back to, I mean, if we're created to move in that direction, I'm on board. But what I wanted to draw attention to with this is there's a sense of this repeat understanding of wisdom and philosophy and knowledge. All of these things are fundamentally called into question by God. There's a sense in which whatever we're doing or understanding at the highest levels as human beings, there's something that is coming in and confronting from the outside that God is doing with that.
This is setting up a hierarchy so that it says, because intelligence, wisdom, what else is in there? Is foolishness because it wasn't created by God. So God is the ultimate authority, and so the question of philosophical or scientific knowledge would always come, subordinate to whatever God says. So, this sort of sets up a hierarchy.
With respect to hierarchy, two responses to that. First, yes, hierarchy between humans and God, that is accurate. There's definitely a sense in that passage and within Barth's theology, there's going to be a clear hierarchy of God above human beings. At the same time, though, there's also a questioning of human hierarchy. Because at the end of the day, there's a limit to what humans are able to say with finality. There's a constant ongoing sense of no matter how far we can strive and how much we can know, there's still going to be a limit. It's an asymptote, if you want to give an annoying little phrase to it. Yeah, I mean, so it's never reached. So there's not a... We'll dig into some of the philosophy that I want to go with here a little bit. But ultimately, what I want to be pointing out here is that there's, in a sense, an equalizing of humans as there's a hierarchization of humans and God. So I like the introduction of hierarchy there, but I do want to kind of undercut the negative aspect of that. Because ultimately, there's a lack of wisdom that can be wielded against other humans because all humans are falling short of this kind of God's eye view.
Isn't this also kind of focusing the question on, what lens do you try to decipher reality with, right? Like, you can use the tools of wisdom, you can look for signs in the world, and then all of a sudden Paul comes along and says, no, it's Christ. It's Christ crucified. And no matter how much you try to figure that out, it's nonsense. I mean, when you think about it, if you really think about Christ on the cross, it's nonsense. You can't logically come to a point where that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like I asked one of my Hindu friends about this, and it was kind of like that in the life of Pi, right? When he wanders into a little Catholic church in India and he looks around and he sees all the imagery on the walls of Christ crucified, and he goes, why would you worship a God like that? I worship Shiva. I worship a warrior. I don't worship a God that was killed on a cross. And I don't know, I guess, maybe relating it back to Barth, that's what I always thought when I read this, right, is that there's a limit to what I myself can do as a human being when trying to filter and think about what is true and what is real. And I have to just draw my eyes back to Christ and keep looking at that as the ultimate, way to filter everything out. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm going off, you know what I mean? But
I think that's even in line with what Barth is saying.
yeah, because I don't think that I've never thought Paul was trying to say, like you're saying, that there's anything wrong with the wisdom of the Greeks, or there's anything wrong with Jews demanding a sign. He's just saying that's not where you're going to find this. You know what I mean?
Right. particularly that understanding of there not being anything wrong with it, and yet it's still called into question. That is the exact dynamic that I want to move forward with Barth. So let's go ahead and move forward here. So, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Question or one more
God
thought.
made foolish the wisdom of the world. Even Jesus was saying, "You are not of the world." And there are so many mystics that just look around and go, "You guys, no, get rid of your stuff. Don't worry about stuff. Worry about each other." And I think that's probably the foolishness and wisdom more what Paul is talking about.
Certainly. Okay, so we're going to give a pretty quick run through of kind of the structure of Barth's thought and what I'm emphasizing here, and then we're going to get into the historical political context. So this is way shorter shrift than I should be doing, but we'll come back to it. And a little bit of this is my specific take on Barth, so I don't know of anybody else that's framing it in this way and thinking about it in this way. So there's that. I don't know. If you run into it, let me know, and I'll just completely have an existential crisis. Okay, so Barth and dialectical theology. So this term dialectical is used in a lot of different contexts. Has anybody ever heard the term dialectical before, and you would associate it with?
Dialectical behavior therapy.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a completely different context. Yeah, excellent. Usually, I was thinking I would usually get something about Hegel, but that's different. That's fine. That's great. This is actually probably closer to that than anything to do with Hegel, but interesting. Okay, so what Barth is dealing with here is this dialectic referring to a confrontational encounter of finite humanity with the infinite God. And he's drawing specifically from Søren Kierkegaard. Anybody familiar with Kierkegaard? Oh, yeah, Pastor Mark quoted him on Sunday. It was funny. I leaned over to my wife and said, I'm going to tell you way too much about this quote afterwards, and I did. Specifically, it's talking about this understanding in exactly the way we were just describing from those verses from Corinthians of there is this kind of realm or sphere of human thought, and there's this confrontational encounter with this finite human thought and the inbreaking Word of God. So there's this specific understanding that's happening, and that is what Barth means by dialectical, and we'll expand upon that as we go. I refer to this as encounter-oriented theological subjectivity. This is partially to recognize the fact that, what I would argue is the fact that Barth is dealing with a particular theological response to the problems of modernity. He will be read by many, particularly in American context, as just doing quote-unquote neo-orthodox thought, which is basically trying to reject modern philosophy. I don't take that, and I follow particularly the work of Bruce McCormack, who has really created this whole segment of Barth studies at Princeton Seminary, along with George Hunsinger and a few others. But I'm following that understanding that particularly addresses that Barth is doing something particular in response to modern thought that gives us something specific to think about. So the sense of subjectivity also reflects the modern move of moving from trying to understand, from the medieval era of trying to understand who we are as humans from some kind of objective reality, either through God or whatever, to post-Descartes, to an understanding of the subject, who I am as a subject, as a thinking subject. That's what we're talking about with subjectivity there. Theological subjectivity would then mean, how do I think and relate to the world, society, the church, etc., within the context of theology? So when I say encounter-oriented, that's going to mean that the subject becomes the subject in and by this encounter with God that is coming from the outside. It doesn't happen rationally, it doesn't happen through experience, and it rejects pretty much all those different ways that different modern theologians would present, including Tillich and Trelch and all those fun guys. Then he's going to take this a step further than Kierkegaard ever got to in any way, shape, or form by establishing this doctrine of the Word of God that is itself dialectical. So this Word of God in its threefold form is throughout dialectical. And how that plays out is really particular, and I'll explain it here. But ultimately, Barth describes it as these concentric circles. So at the center is Jesus Christ, and the revelation of God through Jesus Christ is itself already dialectical, because there is the flesh of Jesus that people see, and that is a necessary medium as a thinking individual experiencing the world. In order to experience the transcendence of God, I have to have something in front of me, some kind of medium to experience, and that medium is the flesh and blood of Jesus. But at the same time, following the Nicene understanding, Jesus is also God. It is God revealed, and yet at the same time, it's veiled by the flesh. So even in that experience of Jesus, it requires some kind of opening of our eyes, our understanding by God through the Holy Spirit. Everybody tracking with this? Questions? Okay. That's fair. Yeah, I know I'm moving fast here. So then the next step out, there's this dialectical understanding of Jesus Christ that is veiled and unveiled at the same time. Veiled by Jesus' flesh being from Nazareth, this backwater in Judea and in the Roman Empire, seemingly insignificant. Famously, there's this confrontation with a representative of the Roman Empire in Jesus right before the crucifixion, and Pilate is just completely dismissive of this individual. And yet, the funny thing about that is, not 300 years later, Christianity begins to take over the entire Roman Empire. There's something fascinating going on there. So there's this veiling and unveiling happening within that. Scripture works in the same way. So you have at the center is the revelation of God through Jesus Christ. Scripture works similarly. It is also dialectical because you have these experiences of Jesus and of God through these different historical moments that are described, but it is veiled because it is written by human beings. This gets us past the inerrancy thing, because you can find errors in the text because it's written by human beings. There's going to be things that are inaccurate, and you don't have to read it to say that this is a science textbook. That's absurd. Sorry, that was an overstatement. Sorry. If any Baptist hears this, I apologize. And then finally, on the outermost rung is church proclamation. So there's this bearing witness to, pointing back to Jesus and Scripture, but church proclamation covers all of the teaching and works of the church. That includes preaching. It includes, he specifically focuses on communion, or the Lord's Supper, or whatever else we're using for that. What other phrase? The sacraments and preaching, and the theology of the church. And the purpose and task of theology itself is to look back over and investigate the current moment of what the church is doing and determine whether it is fulfilling its responsibility and calling according to this encounter with God through Jesus Christ and Scripture. So that's how it all kind of works together. But within all of this, there's this retention of authority over and power within God above the individual or the church, and also society and culture. That becomes a particular thing. Are y'all familiar with Paul Tillich? He tends to be more popular outside of Baptist circles, but if you're not, that's great. That's easier to deal with. But basically, there's an understanding that that pops up and that Tillich is kind of involved with, is of this understanding of kind of seeing God in and through the culture, and through this kind of Hegelian move through the state. Okay. Questions about this? We just went through that very quickly, and this is pretty dense. So. We don't. If it doesn't click fully, that's fine, and we can continue to kind of open things up as we go. But the next section, dealing with the historical part, will be much more easily graspable. Any thoughts before we move on?
Can you explain your last point? Christ against?
Yes. So Barth emphasizes that there's this sense of Christ against the church, because ultimately, by recognizing that. either through Roman Catholicism, which has this understanding that ultimately the Pope, a human individual, can make a statement ex cathedra and it becomes infallible, or through an understanding, whether you're thinking about within his context of Protestant liberalism, of the individual decides interpretation and right action based on the Bible and becomes kind of a free-for-all, or within my Baptist context of we can just get together and just decide what is infallible and what is not. And we can just exclude everybody that disagrees to the point where you completely deny all of your ideals whatsoever. That's a particular Baptist comment, sorry. But anyways, but ultimately, rather than all of that, there's a recognition that when we do theology, we are not making these kind of final, universal, absolute claims. We are responding to an encounter with God that is always open to future encounter. And future encounter occurs primarily through Jesus Christ, Scripture, and church proclamation. He leaves a little space for having experiences outside of that, but those happen outside of the church. He has a really fascinating description of that where he says, you can experience God through, he has this like list of things, but he specifically emphasizes a dead dog or Russian communism. You can experience God through all those things, but this is the designated way that God has chosen to reveal God's self. And that's what guides the church. So one more comment on that. This is a necessarily limiting sense. There's a distinction between philosophy and theology in this that Barth is going to be adamant about. And this is one of the things that separates me from many other scholars who would be dealing, there are some that deal even with a little bit of Levinas and Barth, but I am adamant that you must keep those realms separate. Ultimately, because philosophy is trying to find something that is universal. If you are capable of reason, which includes all human beings, you should be able to come to the truths of philosophy. That is not the case for Barthian theology. You have either been encountered by this God in this way or not. And if you have not, none of it's going to follow. I find that very interesting and compelling to me as an understanding of the church, particularly as recognizing those boundaries of how we relate to others in society, and particularly a democratic society. There's a recognition of my limits, of I cannot put my interpretation of the Bible over onto others that do not value the Bible. I can't do that, and why would I? It messes with some things with respect to evangelism, but that's always been the case for anything that's in the Reformed tradition. That we can maybe talk about if you have questions about. But any thoughts before we move on?
I was thinking two words as you were talking, rigidity or flexibility. Where does it flow in those?
I find a lot of flexibility, but there's a recognition that on some level we have to make a decision. And that decision can be open to critique and change, yes, and in fact it must be. But at the same time, you got to take a stance. And I mean, so he's real big on confession, and we'll see that as it plays out over what we're about to cover. But the idea of a confession is saying, this is how we're interpreting this text in this moment, and this is therefore how we should act. And also, God's probably going to break this down.
I remember people saying to me, as a Methodist, well, you don't believe in any of it. You just believe in everything, kind of thing.
Yeah.
By meaning, you don't believe in something rigidly or stoically or whatever. And yet, it takes, I think, courage to be in that position too. So it's some kind of rigidity in that as well, I suppose.
You know, it's an interesting statement, Bill, because from our point of view as Methodists, we do believe in something. They're called the Articles of Religion. We've got 29 of them. And they're in part of our doctrine that is protected by restrictive rules, which means they can't be changed. And, you know, so my thing is like, and I would ask you this, Michael, I mean, every major religious system on this planet is voluntary by nature. And because of that, to be a part of that religious system involves giving assent to a confession and saying, this is what I believe. And under that set of beliefs, a community is formed, and there's a sense of unity that ensues and a sense of identity that ensues. And others can disagree with that, and others can critique it, but if you're going to wear this merit badge, right, these are the basic building blocks of our religious system. And you're going to have to say yes or no to these things. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? I mean, it does feel like that's exclusive in a way, but I feel without it, going back to your comment, we're kind of just, it's anything goes. And I don't know how you can create unity as expressed in the Bible, especially from that.
So I want to redirect just a little bit, but it might sync back up in a way that I don't necessarily see. And I'll just say this, I think it connects up with ethics specifically. And I want to say two things about that. One, I am not going to this church because y'all are Methodists. I'm going here because of your ethics. I find resonance with how you value people. That is what I am drawn to here. And ultimately, a statement of valuing people despite their differences requires a strong belief. And that might well be rigid. And that's one of the things we'll develop within this series of presentations, is that, dealing with some of the interactions of politics in American society. I'll just lay it out there. I am formed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was rigid in the understanding that human beings have value, and therefore that limits my freedom, ultimately. That's a rigid thing. How we get to that point is what I'm interested in, and how we have that conversation as people in the church and across those boundaries as well is what I'm particularly interested in. So let's move forward, and I think we'll address that here a little bit right now, actually. Yeah, so kind of jumping over to this kind of political conversation, what we've established, I know very quickly and maybe unhelpfully, but what this establishes is a reimagining or reinterpretation, restatement of how we understand freedom. And this is drawing again from Levinas, and I deal with Emmanuel Levinas's philosophy as being philosophy proper. He uses a lot of language from Judaism. That's a kind of a controversial thing, but I read him as a philosopher, and so that kind of jump from Barth speaking to a particular community and Levinas speaking to a universal community is a distinction that I'll continue to kind of comment on, that you can kind of see in the background here. But ultimately, this understanding of freedom would also apply to the context in political philosophy, of this understanding that encounter-oriented subjectivity means that one is not just free to do whatever they want. I find this to be a fundamental flaw within the democratic tradition, going back to Hobbes and Locke, and we'll have room for that in a later session to deal with that a little bit. If you're interested in digging into Hobbes and Locke, I'm your guy. But this understanding is stating that rather than having this fundamentally active freedom, my freedom is passively conditioned and established by this encounter with the other. So ultimately, my freedom is itself already a responsibility, and is a responsibility that is given definition to the church through Jesus Christ, Scripture, and church proclamation. I know how I should respond to this because I've been encountered by God. My world has been rocked through this confrontation, and now I respond to the world and every single person that I meet with this understanding that the ultimate meaning of the universe is self-sacrificial love for the other. That's breaking down how I understand that, and I think in line with Barth, that is how we function as humans who have been encountered by God via Christianity. All right, this means being ethically oriented. So you are conditioned by encounter with the other, and you are oriented toward concrete care for the neighbor or the stranger. This is a distinction that I make. Ultimately, both of those terms are meant to be in kind of a broader sense of whoever you end up encountering. So thinking about the Good Samaritan and who is my neighbor, that person is also outside of the community, but you are called to care for them within that particular teaching by Jesus. and that guides how we should approach things today. I will say more about that kind of relationship as we move forward with the political action part of it. There's also, sorry?
Is the other the same as neighbor and stranger? Or are you saying other is the encounter with God?
So sorry, this gets a little bit into the weeds of the philosophical differences. So the other, for Levinas, will refer to human others, but it's also within this kind of, it's within the structural space philosophically. So that gets a little bit vague, and I know that's unhelpful. For Barth, the other is God, full stop. We are encountered by God, and that's what establishes us as theological subjects. Yes. The distinction there is that as a subject, as someone who has been established as a theological subject who is responding to this encounter, that happens from God, who is the other, the transcendent that is beyond the human sphere and creation. Then I'm oriented toward concrete care, so concrete meaning physical bodies taking care of actual needs for the neighbor or stranger. So one of the tricky things, a lot of people that deal with Levinas, they will use the other for that as well, which is getting away from the structural reality of what's happening there. Not reality, the structural description of the philosophy behind it. And it's important to keep that distinction. So then they'll just go on and say, oh, the other is, this mother who's struggling, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we need different terms for that because it's about the experiential side rather than the subjectivity side. It's in the weeds, sorry. Okay, next, the aspect of particularity, which is a recognition of embodied difference. This is that aspect of because it is outside the frame of human rationality or human thought, I didn't bring about this encounter with God. It didn't happen by me, I can't do it. The only way that I can evangelize is by bearing witness to something that has happened to me. I cannot tell you, hey, this is what you must think in order to get here. I'm not in control of that. That's not how it works. This is an encounter that is not within human hands. It's not something that you rationally do. It's not something that you can fill yourself toward, whatever. That's not how it works. I know that can be a little bit complicated within theological spaces, but the nice part about it is I can recognize that people who didn't have this experience just didn't have that experience. And I can recognize that you're going to disagree with me on things of ultimate value, and yet I still am responsible for your well-being. You can disagree with me. You can think I'm dead wrong. You can think I'm a jerk, whatever. But at the end of the day, I'm still responsible for you because I've been established in this way. This is the only way that I can be, is by this encounter with God. Then this point of perpetual reformation, which we've already touched on a little bit, but this is understanding that when we create theology, when we're thinking about these things, this can't be final. This is not absolute. When we do theology, we're not establishing the words and understanding of God. That's not it. And in fact, whenever we make these statements, when we make these claims, these confessions, they are inevitably open to God calling them into question and pushing us further in, to borrow from C.S. Lewis, who does not agree with a lot of this. But this understanding of perpetual reformation, of constantly needing to make sure that we're on task, that we're doing what we're called and formed to be doing, and to think critically about it. Then finally, the call to political decision. And these are, again, just things that I find of potential interest and emphasis. But this idea that we're called to participate. Because we have this responsibility for others, we can't fall back on this understanding that, you got the state and it's the devil and blah, 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 so we just got to keep our hands clean. It's very non-Hauerwasian, if you're familiar with Stanley Hauerwas. That understanding from John Howard Yoder and the Anabaptist tradition, which I'm not saying things negative about the Anabaptist tradition in general. There's many things that I very much respect, but this is taking a different take of if we're responsible, then if we're responsible and also we are incapable of perfection in the way that we're thinking, then we have to step in. We're called to do something. We're also called to recognize that our steps that we take are limited and open to criticism, but we're also called to take those steps. And we'll add some detail of what I'm talking about here as we move forward. Let me go ahead and dive in here. So, The context for Barth's theology, and particularly where we see his interaction ethically and politically with society, is through what is called the Kirchenkampf, or the church struggle. And this was the struggle between or among the German evangelical churches, which was a confederation of Protestant churches in Germany, against the Deutsche Christen, or German Christians, who were a party of Nazi supporters who lobbied for Hitler's control over the churches. So specifically, we're gonna give a little bit of information about Karl, Barth, and the Kirchenkampf, and then we're gonna step back and see some of the background of the Third Reich and what was happening with that movement. Questions about this before we move on? So one of the main things that Barth will push is the Barmen Declaration, which is basically a statement that refusing, among other things, particularly the Führer principle, the idea that they're recognizing that Hitler has ultimate control over the church. They're going to say, no, God has ultimate control over the church, based on the principles that we've already established. Barth is the leading theologian for this movement, although there are some others that we'll talk about along the way that were also really important. What do we got next here? All right, so these are some symbols, just so we're clear here. I mean, these are some of the symbols of the German Christians, the Deutsche Christen, completely putting together the Nazi movement with Christianity. And another example here, this is one of the pillars in one of the major Lutheran churches in Germany. And if you look closely, you can see here at the right hand of Jesus is a Nazi soldier. So this is a complete amalgamation of the state with Christianity, and this is exactly what Barth is saying. No, we cannot do this. And on top of that, he has a theological argument for why this cannot be. And in fact, this is something that's been ongoing and ongoing and ongoing, and it's how we establish these understandings of principles or culture that violate the very ethics at the core of the message of the gospel and Jesus Christ. Okay, so to jump for a second, all right, so I'm gonna say this first. So again, we're thinking about ethno-nationalism in the German context, but I also want to apply it to the American context as well, and we'll give an example of how that plays out right here, and this is also going to tie into the issue of biblical authority. So Mark Knoll, who is an evangelical historian, I'll read these to you so you don't have to look that closely. But he has this book called The Civil Wars, The Theological Crisis, and the theological crisis ultimately deals with biblical authority. So it's a really interesting, pretty short analysis of the 19th century, going back maybe a little bit before that as well. But he has this to say. The theological crisis of the Civil War was that while voluntary reliance on the Bible had contributed greatly to the creation of American national culture, that same voluntary reliance on Scripture led only to deadlock over what should be done about slavery. From the historical record, it is clear that the American Civil War generated a first-order theological crisis over how to interpret the Bible, how to understand the work of God in the world, and how to exercise the authority of theology in a democratic society. And so thoughts on this before maybe move a little bit further.
I just have some questions. So, the fact that the Protestant denominations don't have a pope, so they don't have this ultimate authority of a human, embodiment of God. Does that make them a lot more vulnerable to these sorts of takeovers, I guess, political takeovers? Whereas, where was the Catholic Church in Germany? Because they had a pope as the ultimate authority on earth. Is there a separation there to make Protestant denominations much more vulnerable to this sort of co-opting of a whole, religious structure for the benefit of, whatever authoritarian decides to take it over?
So just to lay this out there, just personally, I don't know, and maybe this just is my own embodied position, but I can't find myself arguing for more authoritarian structures. I'm arguing from a necessarily democratic position, which means that there's something that is available to us that does not require power being exerted to keep us in line. However, to also...
I'm not arguing for it.
No, I know, no. So to...
Does that make it, there's sort of different tracks and different vulnerabilities?
So it's a tricky argument about the Catholic Church in relation to the Third Reich itself. So, man, I want to overstate this. So there is a recognition. So I want to put this partially into historical context, and I'm also going to be saying this, and I want to recognize my limitations as a Protestant thinker. I'm a Protestant, so I am going to be more lenient upon the Catholic Church than others would be because I'm not a part of them, but they're also my cousin. I don't know, whatever. So there's a recognition early on of the Catholic Church. I mean, the Pope at the time, I don't know the Pope, that Benedict, I don't know, that's not right. But there's a new king coming up in Germany. So we'll talk a little bit more about the history, but there's this modern democracy that's put in place after World War I, and then it seems to be quickly falling apart back into an authoritarian structure. But the Catholic Church isn't new to authoritarian structures. I mean, going back to particularly the medieval period, I mean, and from the very beginning, I mean, hierarchical structure with one person on top is kind of the norm in history. So they slow play that, like most other nations around the world ultimately did, of slow playing, trying to intervene against Hitler's rise to power, because we've kind of seen it before. This isn't necessarily something new as far as a state structure.
The Catholic Church folded to the Nazis.
Yeah.
They did, but
They had to get along with them, or they were gonna annihilate the Catholic or the Pope, or,
that changes once the war effort begins. And there starts to be much more tension between the Catholic Church in Germany, and at the same time, there's a bunch of Catholic people on the ground that are fighting the Nazis. So I want to be very mindful about that. There are solid movements within Germany that are resisting Nazi influence in various ways that I just want to be mindful of. And yeah, I mean, I would argue that ultimately, man, I don't want to overstate this, but yeah, as someone who's from a low church tradition, hierarchy tends to be more problematic with political power than not. But that might just be my perspective.
Wouldn't a contemporary issue be the gay issue?
At the time, in Germany?
Wouldn't a contemporary issue, a theological crisis, in a sense, be the gay issue that we have today?
It's the same. What I want to argue is it's the same root cause.
Right.
Yeah, a complete disagreement.
Same stroke.
Yeah, yeah, and ultimately, that same problem is what I'm kind of teasing a little bit here is that this ultimately leads to the breakdown between modernist and fundamentalist traditions, and that brings up inerrancy and all that goes with that as well. But there's a fundamental understanding prior to this point in America. There's this understanding that you pick up the Bible, you read it, and you're going to be able to get the truth. Slavery was the question that broke that idea. And that's something that we have not solved. And I want to argue that Barth's understanding of the Word of God in its threefold form offers a solution to that. It's not going to be acceptable to everybody, but it might be acceptable to a good number of conservatives if it's made properly, if the argument is made properly. Because ultimately, there is an understanding of biblical authority, which is what inerrancy is trying to hold on to. It's just it does it in this particular context of 19th century philosophy that is no longer valid. It was dependent upon a Newtonian understanding of the universe that was broken apart by Einstein and Bergson and a bunch of others. And we're living in better times to some degree. Anyways, that was a soapbox. All right. So this idea of biblical authority getting into the American political context is why I wanted to draw attention to these quotes. So now I want to jump back into and look a little bit at what we're actually dealing with Nazism. Are we cool with that? This might be a little bit lengthy, but I find it worth it because we hear so much junk about Hitler and the Nazis and Germany and blah, 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 without getting any accurate information or actually thinking deeply about it. So I'm passionate about this. If this becomes a little bit too tedious, please speak up. Let me know when we can move faster or move past some things. But just to set the groundwork, Treaty of Versailles of 1919 ended the First World War. Woodrow Wilson goes over to Europe, preaches these 14 points that are meant to encourage Germany. 14 points is a really problematic phrase now that I'm thinking about it. That's another thing dealing with Nazism later. anyways, just hold on to that. So he encourages Germany to surrender and argues that the terms would not be punitive, but Britain and France want these really strict punitive measures, and it ends up going so poorly that people will say that they won the war but lost the peace. And the main emphasis for Wilson was the creation of the League of Nations, which doesn't even pass in Congress. So you've got this burgeoning superpower in the United States that's picking up the pieces after World War I, trying to establish this League of Nations, which is actually a reference from Immanuel Kant, and is the predecessor for the UN, the United Nations. Goodness gracious. This fails miserably. And because the Treaty of Versailles is so economically detrimental to Germany, it's going to cause so many problems in the interwar years. But also, during World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II is deposed as the leader of Germany, and they establish a new modern democracy that's referring to and based upon the American system, but also that's immediately directed by Max Weber, who was a very famous sociologist at the time. So yeah, you have a complete change in Germany that happens because of this, but also with a lot of animosity toward the Allies. Okay, so authoritarianism in the 1930s. I just want to run through these really quickly. Don't worry about reading every word of this, but Mussolini's fascist government gains control of the Italian government via a coup in 1922. Then in May of 1922, Lenin suffers a stroke and Joseph Stalin becomes supervisor of Lenin's health, and by that role, consolidated power. That's a really interesting kind of tension between those two. Following the 1936 Spanish Civil War, General Francisco Franco establishes a fascist military dictatorship in Spain. And I'll show some images real quick to bring some interesting things to that as well. But in 1937, Japan goes to war with China, and this is also when the rape of Nanjing happens, which is just a really horrible event that's often not talked about. So Mussolini, Stalin, and there's Franco on the top left. These are images from the rape of Nanjing, and then Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls takes place in and surrounding the Spanish Civil War. So just in case you wanted to know about the little historical thing. Also, the Spanish Civil War is one of the first times that, this is the first time, that bombs are dropped from planes in a war. In a war proper. There's probably some earlier things that I'm missing, but Picasso's Guernica is based on that same event, or that same war. Okay, so I'm going to go through pretty quickly the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich. These are, again, things that maybe not heard about, but if you do and you want to pepper in some comments and stuff, I'm down. I'm going to move quick, but you can interrupt me. So, cool. Okay, November 1923, there's what's referred to as the Beer Hall Putsch. So this is different from a coup because coups typically involve the military, whereas this is a violent overthrow of the government, but not through the military. So 2,000 Nazis, followers of Hitler, march on the city center in Munich, Bavaria, and are confronted by a police cordon, and 16 Nazi members and 4 police are killed. Because of that, Hitler is charged with treason and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, but the judges are super lenient on him, and he only serves 9 months, and during that time, he writes Mein Kampf. Y'all familiar with all this? It's a fascinating thing. Also, really horrifying in our present context because we're somewhere in that space right now as far as a big event to overthrow things and then not really following up with much judicial action. All right, 1929, the Great Depression hits Germany hard. This is partially due to the massive war debts from the Versailles Treaty. So the people are getting more and more frustrated, and there's an understanding that this type of government with this modern democracy is something that is foreign to the German people. So the German people are starting to push against it. Then, 1929, Weimar president, so the Weimar Republic is the name for the democracy in Germany at the time. Paul von Hindenburg uses emergency powers to establish a chancellor and cabinet positions to rule via these emergency powers rather than the Reichstag or parliament. So the Weimar Constitution included this Emergency Powers Act and these two positions of chancellor and president is controversial, but we'll actually end up dealing in a later session with why that was put in there and some of the theory behind it, coming from particularly this one Nazi jurist named Karl Schmidt that continues to influence political thought in some pretty interesting ways, although he's, obviously not great. But this deadlock in Congress keeps leading to these problems that they have these emergency powers to deal with, which we lack in ours. So this was actually seen as an improvement upon the American Constitution. But at the same time, we're dealing with a similar issue of constant deadlock and just arguing and bickering without creating worthwhile laws. Okay, 1932, von Hindenburg's term ends, and though he wants to retire, he's 84 at the time, he runs and wins. In that election, the Nazi Party wins 37% of the vote. This is mostly due to this extensive propaganda that we'll deal with here in a little bit. Oh, I said that on there. And at that point, Hitler becomes chancellor. So 1933, there's this Reichstag fire. So the place where Congress meets, again, another really kind of weird echo of history. An arson, probably goaded by Nazi members, sets fire to the Reichstag, and Hitler immediately blames the communists. They are soon sent to the newly constructed Dachau concentration camp. And we'll talk more a little bit about that kind of relationship there. And again, when I say this kind of event, this is a violent attack on the seat of Congress. Anyways, okay. 1934, Hindenburg dies, and Hitler assumes the dual roles of president and chancellor. And that's the point where he becomes a dictator. Then June 30th through July 2nd of 1934, there's what's referred to as the Night of the Long Knives. So Hitler has all these competing Nazi leaders killed, including Ernst Röhm, head of the SA. Anyways. What was interesting about that is that Röhm and a number of other Nazi leaders were very liberal in their kind of culture and lifestyle. So Röhm was an openly gay man. And so when people are describing Hitler's rise to power and Nazism, there's this understanding of, oh, they were leftist because it included blah, blah, blah. But through these different moments, there's a shifting of power away from these different people, and they become the outsiders, and they are killed or otherwise sent to concentration camps and et cetera. And one of these particular moments is the Night of the Long Knives. So you got to be really careful. I know it's easy to kind of make these arguments that, oh, this must be on the left, blah, blah, blah. That's a real overstatement of the history of what was happening there. Then in 1935, Hitler institutes the Nuremberg Laws, which limited the freedoms of non-Aryan citizens. We'll talk a little bit more about what Aryan means. Also, we'll go ahead and I think there's a picture. Pause.
Was Hitler elected as chancellor, or was he appointed?
That is, I don't think he was elected to that. I don't think that's an elected position.
Because I think my vague recollection of this history is that he maneuvered
Yeah.
to get himself appointed, and then he was like the number 2 guy, but then he moved into the number 1 position. Maybe that's when, yeah, he died.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was a lot of maneuvering, but I thought at some point he ran for election, and I couldn't remember if he was elected or if that was failed election.
It's been a minute. I'll have to come back and take a look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's important to know, I mean, if it was an election, it would be important to know that enough Germans voted for him.
So yes. So I guess it was on the previous one. Oh yeah, no, the 37%. So that's when he is elected, regardless. Yeah.
Well, it means his party was elected.
Right. Right.
I thought
Yes.
Chancellor was an appointed position.
Okay.
I might have gotten that backwards. I think he did become president there. That should be the case. I will double check that. Sorry, that might be inaccurate. We'll follow up on that. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, regardless, yeah, he is voted in democratically. Yeah. One of the things we'll kind of deal with and we'll kind of touch on as we go potentially is that technically every single thing the Nazis did was legal. And that ends up becoming a really particular concept within political philosophy that we'll deal with on another time. Hannah Arendt is a really good voice for dealing with the problematic implications of that. It particularly deals with the concept of sovereignty, because the concept of sovereignty is that if you have a nation that is agreed upon the set of laws and this power structure, then they are sovereign. There's no one else in the world that can tell them what to do. It's a concept that comes from theology, that God is sovereign, but we use it for these kind of political circumstances. But within that then, how can a foreign sovereign hold other people accountable? And that's a lot of the reason for the UN, although that's tricky and hasn't worked that well. But moving on. Sorry, one more comment about the Nuremberg laws. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but one of the fascinating things that about the Nuremberg laws is that they are a particular moment that show the kind of odd relationship between Hitler's ideology and America. Because one of the main resources used to determine those laws was the Jim Crow South. It actually influenced Hitler. It's rough. So, over the next 6 years, Hitler transitions Germany into a police state and begins rearmament in violation of the 1919 treaty. And we'll talk about some of these ideas as we move forward. But Hitler preaches and practices the reach for Lebensraum and diplomatically reacquires land lost from Versailles from the treaty. And then we'll very quickly start to non-diplomatically take that land. On November 9th, 1938, Joseph Goebbels incites Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, where nearly 1,000 synagogues were set on fire and 76 were destroyed, more than 7,000 Jewish businesses and homes looted, and about 100 Jews were killed, and as many as 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps to be tormented, many for months. And that's coming from this USF timeline. Then September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland, and thus we begin World War II. And during this time, this is when, Germany just becomes a horrifying place for non-Aryans and anybody that disagrees. Things had been kind of shrouded in, oh, they don't really mean that, until this point. And now, all bets are off. So I wanted to deal with I wanted to present to you a couple of the sources I'm dealing with here. William Shirer, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, is a nice, thick history that I just absolutely love, particularly because he was actually an American correspondent as a journalist in Germany. And so some of the references that he makes of, I know specifically, he's got some direct quotes from Hitler and Himmler, I want to say, that are from his own recollection. And that's just pretty fascinating. I value historical pieces that are closer to that moment, although later sources are also helpful for we get access to information as we move forward. But I really like these points of view as well. Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is another thick, excellent book that she traces back to really early modern era forward. She is a Jewish philosopher. She flees Germany once the crackdowns really begin. But she has this really interesting relationship, particularly with Martin Heidegger, who was a major philosopher at the time and actually majorly influential on Levinas, and was a real problem because Levinas was also, his entire family was killed in the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. Then finally, they thought they were free. I actually don't quote from this in this at all, but this is just a fantastically interesting book because this guy, Milton Mayer, he goes back to Germany in the 50s and just interviews people that were in the party but not active Nazi officials and stuff to just get their perspectives. And it was just a really fascinating read. It's really interesting to see how people were actually thinking, and this idea that they thought that the Third Reich was establishing freedom for them. And this is after the war. This is after the fact. So it's heavy. Okay, so some defining features of Hitlerism. And I use the term Hitlerism mainly because scholars from the time use that term. It was understood that this kind of structure of government was totally oriented by this personality. So it was called Hitlerism as opposed to later terms that we'd use now because, unfortunately, we've seen very similar structures of government that we want to compare it to that are not really specific to a personality. But Bill Shire writes, in the first volume of Mein Kampf, Hitler discoursed at length on this problem of Lebensraum, or living space, a subject which obsessed him to his dying breath. Acquisition of new soil, Hitler continued, and explaining the blindness of German pre-war foreign policy was possible only in the East. If land was desired in Europe, it could be obtained by and large only at the expense of Russia, and this meant that the new Reich must again set itself on the march along the road of the Teutonic Knights of old to obtain by the German sword sod for the German plow and daily bread for the nation. So that's a quote from Mein Kampf. I will be quoting from Mein Kampf here some. Sorry, don't love that, but I want to get an accurate depiction of what's happening with these ideas. One of the things that I do want to draw attention to, since we've already mentioned the Crusades, the Teutonic Knights, the Crusades just continue to affect history way past the first one. And in fact, it stops being about the Holy Land after a while, and it starts being about people who don't appropriately believe within Europe. And that's what the Teutonic Knights were doing. They're trying to fish out these different heretical sects and people who were still following pre-Christian beliefs, all kinds of stuff like that. But these happen constantly throughout Europe in the modern era and leading up to the modern era. So like the Inquisition would be a similar thing of trying to find anybody that's not lining up appropriately and changing their minds by force. So, meaning of National Socialism. Hitler's statement at trial following the beer hall putsch. He makes this statement in this moment. He says, "Believe me, I do not regard the acquisition of a minister's portfolio as a thing worth striving for. I do not hold it worthy of a great man to endeavor to go down in history just by becoming a minister. One might be in danger of being buried beside other ministers." And again, minister is in the political context of ministry, political power, just so we're clear. "My aim from the first was 1,000 times higher than becoming a minister. I wanted to become the destroyer of Marxism. I am going to achieve this task, and if I do, the title of minister will be an absurdity so far as I am concerned." So one of the things that often you'll hear again is this understanding that, it's National Socialism. So it's socialism, so it's a left-leaning thing, it's in line with Marx and all that stuff. And I think there's an interesting connection that could potentially be made, but it's way overstated, and particularly the people that are arguing that, you got to question their motives of why they're saying that, particularly because Hitler's going to be absolutely against Marxism because Marxism is about empowering the masses. He is not for that. He is for a hierarchical society and defined in particular ways that we'll continue to look at. So again, National Socialism here. So Shire writes, "And though the very name of the Nazi Party proclaimed it as socialist, Hitler was even more vague on the kind of quote-unquote socialism he envisaged for the new Germany. This is not surprising in view of a definition of a socialist which he gave in a speech on July 28, 1922. So this is going to give you his understanding of what Hitler understood as socialist. "Whoever is prepared to make the national cause his own to such an extent that he knows no higher ideal than the welfare of his nation. Whoever has understood our great national anthem, Deutschland über alles, to mean that nothing in the world surpasses in his eyes this Germany, people, and land. That man is a socialist." It is tied to the understanding of nation. There's no separating those two. And even if you wanted to say, if you wanted to define socialism as some kind of like putting it into the political economy frame of government intervention on behalf of someone, the someone is the nation and the nation alone. So within Germany, there's still going to be largely free trade happening. And you can still see, there are still businesses that made money under the Nazi regime that are still in existence today. And that's clearly not communism. It's not socialism with any of those understandings. But what it was government was deciding who could and couldn't take part in commerce in the country. It's National Socialism. It can't be separated. And they're very different from any writing of Marx is going to be talking about the proletariat of this largest group of people, the majority. Hitler's not for the majority. He's for a very small group of people. So I include these images here just to give a glimpse of Nazis on the march, but also, anybody read some German? What's that say?
Death to Marxism.
Death to Marxism, yeah. All right, moving forward. All right, so now we're going to get an understanding of what the nation is. So Shire here is dealing with Mein Kampf, so there's going to be some references. That's what the text. That's the text he's dealing with here. So he says, "Who is nature's favorite child, the strongest in courage and industry?" Quoting from Mein Kampf, "On whom Providence has conferred the master's right, the Aryan." Here in Mein Kampf, we come to the kernel of the Nazi idea of race superiority, of the conception of the master race on which the Third Reich and Hitler's New Order in Europe were based. And so this is a quote from Mein Kampf, and Hitler writes, "All the human culture, all the results of art, science, and technology that we see before us today are almost exclusively the creative product of the Aryan. This very fact admits of the not unfounded inference that he alone was the founder of all higher humanity, therefore representing the prototype of all that we understand by the word man. It was he who laid the foundations and erected the walls of every great structure in human culture." This is what concerns me when you hear conversations about Western culture being ultimate. That is a problematic view, and something that I ran into a lot at the classical school that I was teaching at, and it's one of the reasons I'm not there anymore.
You could even make the argument that that's a problematic view even within Christian circles, because the Eastern Empire survived for centuries after the fall of Rome. So, the Byzantine Empire had more of an influence on our thought than Rome ever did in the beginning in my eyes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the interesting things that is somewhat, I regularly have trouble coming to grips with is the longstanding racism within Europe, between Eastern and Western Europe. And I mean, some of it at least goes back to that split between East and West. But when Hitler's saying that land needs to be taken from the East, he sees that as these lesser people are in that land that is supposed to be the Germans. They are supposed to be the leaders, and it is therefore their land. Rhetoric, again, that we can see, ironically, coming from Russia, this level, but that same kind of argument is an apt comparison. And so with respect to that kind of Eastern influence in the church, I mean, you also have, there's a clear move here to try to remove any Jewish influence, which has an ugly history, and we'll deal with a little bit of that here. But we can maybe come back to these in a later session too, because there's a lot to dig into here. But I just want to give a very quick overview of some of the history of anti-Semitism in Europe. And of course, I should have changed that, sorry, but I'll change that later. Anti-Semitism, of course, refers to understanding of Jewish people, whether religion or culture. That's kind of open over the years. But this is a long problem in Europe, particularly following the Crusades in the late Middle Ages. So as there's this conflict over what is truth between these different takes between Islam and Christianity, there's this renewed focus on difference within Europe. There's immediately, because of the Crusades, there's a lot of moves, particularly in France is one of the main ones that I look at, is that they expel all Jewish people. And the fact that there's a confrontation with difference with Islam leads to confrontations with Judaism. Then jumping way forward, there's a lot in the Middle Ages. You'll hear a lot of this stuff come up, and we'll deal with this a little bit later when we talk about conspiracy theories in one of the later sessions, because all of this stuff still applies. But within the Middle Ages, there's what's referred to as blood libel. So there's this understanding, I mean, these accusations against Jewish people that they poison wells and drink the blood of children. This stuff just never goes away. God, it's frustrating. Anyways, so that's all coming from the late Middle Ages and just continues to crop back up as propaganda. There's a thing called the Dreyfus Affair, which is really fascinating, a French political scandal from roughly 1894 to 1906. There was an accusation that a Jewish officer worked as a spy against his own people, and it turned into this big thing. And basically, it was proven that all of these accusations were fabricated, and yet it didn't really help tamp down anti-Semitism. But also from around this time, there's what's referred to as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was this forged document made in 1900 by agents of the Tsarist Russian secret police. That basically just keeps popping back up. And so hold on to that title, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, because it's going to pop back up today, unfortunately. By utilizing all of these already present forms of anti-Semitism, Hitler blames German struggles, including the loss of World War I and the Versailles Treaty, on Jewish people. And again, we can see another reference to Marxism here that's really important. This is from Mein Kampf, quoted through Shire. So Hitler writes, in opposition to the bourgeois and Marxist Jewish worlds, the folkish philosophy finds the importance of mankind in its basic racial elements. In the state, it sees only a means to an end and construes its end as the preservation of the racial existence of man. So again, these are statements of Nazism that you still see. And specifically, I want to draw attention to this combination of Marxist and Jewish. And again, this goes back to Marx himself was Jewish. And although he wasn't practicing and was fundamentally against religion, he's going to be marked as racially Jewish by Nazis and by Hitler. And this term that will be thrown around a lot is Judeo-Bolshevism, this combination of being Jewish and communist in some way, or Marxist. So this is just a picture of how you would determine, according to the Nuremberg laws, what your race was. And you can see the matrilineal part on the Jewish side. And it's fascinating. I ran into a colleague of mine at DU, a German woman. She actually refuses to say the word Jude because it is a derogatory term in German because of this era. But again, this framework is something that is in large part drawn from miscegenation laws in the Jim Crow South. So,
I went to an exhibit of original manuscripts. These manuscripts were from like the 1500s. I mean, they're just preserved, under glass. And the exhibit was exploring anti-Semitism way back in all kinds of. These were church documents. These were church publications, and throughout, there was a lot of. There were a lot of illustrations, so that's really what.
Was there a particular scholar that was putting that together?
I don't know.
There's a really good book that might interest you. It's called The Dark Mirror by I believe it was by Sarah Lipton. I don't want to be accurate, but there's a really good. She does this really fascinating analysis of artwork about and from Jewish people from the Middle Ages to trace how those kind of stereotypes came about. And it's a really fascinating read. I highly recommend it.
The cartoons were very, very stereotypical, damaging it.
Oh, it's horrible, yeah.
Anyway, my point is just that this goes back to 1400s,
Oh, yeah.
1500s,
Yep.
1600s, so this wasn't new.
Definitely not.
It was something that was always an undercurrent in Europe.
Right. I mean, yeah, and going back to Barth's argument, the fact that continues to be a part of European society despite being fully Christian, it's a real sign that something's wrong with their theology. Okay, I'm going to move past. This is a really fascinating quote about mass propaganda, and specifically just Hitler railed against the Lügenpresse, or the lying press, which, anyways, resonances. So, so just a couple of pieces of propaganda here. So this is again tying this Jewish obsession. You can see particularly like the Orthodox get up to draw this attention, and a majority of people, particularly in German cities, there were plenty of Jewish people that were fully modernized, not looking like this, but the tie to Marxism or communism with the hammer and sickle, and even the coins to see that kind of approach. And then you see what the idea that they're trying to protect this Aryan family. Again, kind of propaganda that is not unfamiliar to us. All right, so this is just a little bit about the Holocaust. I'm not going to focus on this too much, but we can come back to it. Really horrible. Keep an eye out for the phrase Arbeit macht frei, work makes free, because that is the entrance to Auschwitz. That's something that gets thrown around by, again, some of these ideologues on Twitter or whatever, and it's just like, we should not be okay with this. Anyways, these are some images from the Yad Vashem. And I know this is tricky, and I heard somebody else talking about the current stuff happening with Israel-Palestine, and our ethical reflection will not be limited from that. But at the same time, it's just really horrible. And horrible as a reflection on Euro-American society.
Well, I have to say, I went here, and I took the group there, and
basically this huge circle that is filled with shelves, and it's lined with volumes that contain the names of those people that they found. And the most moving part of it is there's empty shelves.
Yeah, they constantly
They're still
continue.
finding names. And it just gives you like this physical representation of what that massive loss of life looked like. You know what I mean? Like even this massive hall can't contain it.
So I came to know about Yad Vashem because of a presentation in a class that I took on text image artifact of Judaism and art over the years and the different tensions between that. But there's some really fascinating Holocaust museums, in particular the one in Berlin, I believe. It's actually designed, the design itself is meant to make you feel the disorientation and discomfort. So the entire building itself, rather than having an approach of memory or the American, the U.S. Holocaust Museum is more focused on data. So that's why you see like the pile of shoes and clothes and things like that, whereas the one in Berlin is more of an art piece, trying to get you to feel just the horror of it. Really want to visit and see that to experience it. But yeah, but also with that, the different contexts you can see in museum design, just really weird just aside, there's a recognition pretty early on from the American perspective that people are going to deny that this happened. And Eisenhower went and experienced the camps for himself because he knew, and he stated, people are going to act like this didn't happen. And so the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is dealing with that part of it. So I want to turn here. 1 second, I'll get to your question. We're probably going to need to cut it short this time, so we'll pick this up next time. But I want to come back over to the American context a little bit because, again, they're interwoven in an interesting way. And at least part of the anti-interventionist perspective in the United States, holding us back from entering World War II, was that there were a good number of people that agreed with the Nazis and wanted to work with them. And it's an ugly part of our history, but it's a part of our history that we absolutely must confront. Question?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, my first husband, his grandparents were from Germany. And his grandparents and his aunt went to the concentration camp, and they were murdered.
Yeah.
And his dad and uncle went to New York, and then his mother, they met here, so she got away too. But they did get restitution after the war.
Yeah.
He and his brother.
Yeah, but it just passes down generations too. My dissertation advisor, Sarah Pessin, maybe I shouldn't tell this story if it's going to be recorded, but so her grandmother was a survivor, and it continues to shape her thought, and it's one of the things that draws her toward Emanuel Levinas, and it's a lot.
Yeah, they were murdered, and all their land was taken, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, they had a small dairy farm and stuff, in a small town.
Yeah.
But
So, do you want to continue for like 5 more minutes, or we need to cut it?
You've got 20 minutes left on
Yeah,
this.
it goes to 8:30.
Oh, it does go to 8:30?
no,
It goes to 8.
8 o'clock.
I've got 20 minutes worth of stuff on this tape, so.
How about we cut it and we'll cut it in half and we'll say 10 more minutes? We got that? If y'all need to leave, it's fine. Just a little bit. So here's a fascinating thing. I've taught U.S. history, so this is pulling a little bit from what I teach. And one of the fascinating things is that Charles Lindbergh is such a fascinating figure because he becomes really one of the first American celebrities. But he also completely falls from grace because of this moment where he leads the America First Committee. I'm sure you heard in the news that language popped back up around 2016. But he led this, and it was kind of a question of where exactly he stood. But this speech in Des Moines, Iowa in 1941 really started to solidify his fall. And he blames the war on these 3 groups, which are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. And this argument against FDR it continues, and it is explicitly anti-Semitic. I mean, they're arguing that he's trying to establish socialist policies because he's Jewish or has Jewish influences. And just you see this reverberate and reverberate. Yeah, we'll move on from that. So we also have the Nye Committee. So there was this theory that was somewhat proved accurate that, that different war manufacturers in different ways influenced America entering World War I. And there's pretty good evidence found that that was the case, which didn't help things. This is a pretty ugly thing that you may or may not know about, but one of the main reasons that anti-Semitism becomes really popular in the United States is because of Henry Ford. And I'll say this and pause. My dad builds racing engines for a living. Huge Ford guy. I'm not attacking the family or whatever. Just saying that. But in 1920, he buys this Dearborn Independent, this newspaper, prior to 1920. But he runs this series of articles titled "The International Jew: The World's Foremost Problem." And in this series, he reprints the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and he makes arguments that essentially Jewish infiltration of American economic system is causing our downfall. These articles were turned into a book, which circulated over 500,000 copies throughout the U.S. We'll return to this a little bit later because the protocols will be printed again by this radio conspiracy theorist in the 80s. And fascinatingly, that actually, because he has these like super libertarian leanings and anti-government leanings, he'll be picked up in prisons and becomes really influential for particular like prison-associated rap groups. So he starts to have an influence on black communities as well. It's really messed up. And then also that same guy will have a major influence on Alex Jones. We'll deal with that later. But Ford actually received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, which was the highest honor for foreigners from Nazi officials in 1938, from which we get this lovely image. There's a lot of sarcasm here. I hope the sarcasm comes across. All right. All right, so, and fascinatingly, on top of that, Ford is the only American praised in Hitler's Mein Kampf. So this is actually from Mein Kampf. He says, these reflections are copied for the most part from the Dearborn Independent, Mr. Henry Ford's newspaper. Much of the anti-Semitic propaganda once disseminated by this journal is still current in Germany. Hitler is making the argument that Ford actually influences anti-Semitism in Germany, which, make of that what you will. That's just fascinating to me. Deeply disturbing, but also fascinating. So